Today we're going to do a short video and give you guys an update on this Green Island Ficus. I started this tree about 6.5 years ago and it looked quite different at that time. I just reviewed the video again this morning and it's funny to look back at some of those old pictures and see how the tree actually started. We're going to actually put a couple of those clips in here so you can see some of the process that got it to where it is today. But when I got this tree, it was a large tree for the landscape with no lower limbs. It was done as a topiary, and we essentially removed every branch on the tree, and we used some of those larger branches that had aerial roots to do what's called a peg graft and insert them where we needed them lower on the tree. That would be this large left pad here, the right hand pad over here, and we did a back branch, which you'll see later on. The rest of the limbs grew from the trunk itself and were developed with wiring over time. The peg graft is pretty much the most rudimentary or simple graft you could do. You're essentially just taking a larger limb that's being supported by aerial roots to keep it alive, drilling a hole in the trunk that matches up with the caliper of the limb, inserting it, and then hoping that time kind of grafts it into place. The trunk of the ficus, as it grows and swells, locks around that peg, and the roots keep it alive and fused to the trunk, and 6 years later you're left with something like this. So there are a couple things that can go wrong, slow the process. I'll show you some of those after the initial video here, and we'll talk about that and do some close-ups on the limbs themselves in a few minutes. But about 6.5 years in development from a raw, just bare trunk. So thank you.
Okay, this is another large Green Island Ficus that we have. Really nice big trunk. He has cut off some of the branches, you can see all around, and we're going to be grafting this tree to give it some lower branches that is much needed. Here's some of the pieces, and we're going to do some grafting. Okay, we're here back with the Green Island peg grafting. We have done a couple of them already. We're in the process of doing another. You measure the caliper of the piece, and then you drill a hole the same size. And then the roots go in the soil you see below. And we've done a couple already. Another there, and this is another. So we're giving some branches on this large ficus, Green Island. You can see now. It's got some branches where it needed. So we have 1, 2, and the third one.
How's it look? Oh, good branches. Yeah. The first branch that we're going to talk about is the tree's lower right branch, and that is a graft that we did and had very good success with. As you saw in the initial video, the aerial roots on most of these grafts have thickened up quite a bit. If you look in close, when she zooms in there, you'll see the original union, and you can still see there is a little bit of grafting paste around that point where the limb was drilled into the trunk. That's because the last time I worked the tree, probably 2 years ago, there was still a little bit of a gap at some spots there, so I have that paste just to ensure the moisture is kept out. It might be completely fused at this point if I were to peel that off. I'll look at it next year when I do the refinement work. Lower on that graft, on the aerial root itself here, we would have had some screws somewhere in this area where we would have screwed that root to the trunk itself for stability. And there were of course screws in the top of the graft to hold it in place. So that branch was pretty straightforward, no issues at all. So as we move over to the tree's left-hand branch, this graft took very well also. You can see it's fused pretty seamlessly against the trunk there. There's actually a screw hole here where we did insert a screw to pin that root close to the trunk. Also up here, it has fused nicely. The branch is right against the base of the trunk. That wasn't always the case in the original video. There's a gap, a pretty large gap between this limb and the trunk. What happened with that is the original peg rotted out, died back before it could fuse, and we had to actually recut it and move this branch closer to the trunk, which adjusted the angle of the limb a little bit, which we then compensated for with wiring. But this branch did have an adjustment at one point, and actually that peg was put in deeper, you could say. A portion of it was removed and it was inserted deeper, which that can happen with these peg grafts over time. On this rear branch, you can see the original hole that we drilled here in the trunk to insert the peg. And if you look, obviously the branch is not in that hole. It's over here kind of to the side, just against the trunk. And again, like that left-hand branch, there wasn't an initial fusion between the peg and the tree itself. And the limb, that end part of the limb, started to die back because the roots weren't feeding that side of the branch. So what we've done in this case, we ran out of essentially living tissue to put into the hole that we had drilled. So there were some adjustments as far as how the root developed to pull the root closer to the trunk. And we've actually inserted some new screws here, and we've taken a lot of the aerial roots and kind of draped them over the branch to, or over the aerial root, I should say, to lock it into place. When we did that work a couple of years ago, it actually lowered the branch, so that's why we were no longer in line with the hole. So we've taken some aerial roots from higher in the tree, kind of crisscrossed them over that union, that old union point. With time, as these aerial roots get closer to that size, that hole will be kind of closed off and it won't be as noticeable. So this is the branch that developed the least favorably in terms of the union, but as you can see, we still have a large, nice pad, a good back branch here that's doing very well health-wise. It's, you know, grown, filled in, and it gives us what we needed for depth to the rear of the tree. So it's been about 2 years since I've worked on this tree's refinement. We'll be doing that this coming summer, and I'll go through, do a lot more wiring. Some of the branches, like this pad's dropped down a little bit. That'll get moved up with some wire. Obviously, you know, we'll get it back into shape, but it's just kind of been growing and happy for the past 2 years. And I wanted to show you guys today a little bit of how this tree's developed over time. Gives you a little bit of a vision as to what I'm hoping for on some of these trees when I do a first styling and they're cut back to essentially a bare trunk or a bare stump. You know, we do have an end goal in mind, something like this, and in this tree's case, it's came along and developed very well over the past 6 years. So it's has a nice place here in the garden, and I look forward to continuing to develop this tree over the next 6 years. So, thank you.